Last year, I participated in what I was told was a psychological experiment for 6 months. I found an ad in the local newspaper looking for creative people who wanted to earn good money. And since it was the only ad that matched my qualifications, I called them and was scheduled for an interview. I was told that all I had to do was sit alone in a room with sensors attached to my head that would record my brain activity. While in the room, I had to imagine my doppelganger. They called it a tulpa. Seemed easy enough, and I agreed as soon as I found out how much I would be paid. The next day, I started work. They took me to a room with a bed, attached sensors to my head, and connected them to a small black box on the table next to the bed. I was told that I had to imagine a visual image of my double, and they explained that if I got tired or bored, instead of moving, I should imagine my double walking around the room, try to talk to him, and so on. The idea was that he would be with me in the room at all times. The first few days were difficult. It took more effort than the simple daydreaming I had indulged in before. I would imagine my double for a few minutes, but then I would start to get distracted. However, on the 4th day, I was able to imagine his presence for the entire 6 hours. I was told that I was doing very well. A week later, I was moved to another room with wall-mounted speakers. I was told that they wanted to see if I could imagine the tulpa despite the distractions. The music they played was unpleasant, disgusting, and disturbing, and it became a little more difficult to imagine my visual image, but I managed. The following week, they played even more disturbing music with violins, the background of which sounded like an old modem dialing a number, and a guttural voice spoke in some foreign language. I just laughed at it. By that time, I was already a pro. After about a month, I started to get bored. To entertain myself, I started talking to my doppelganger. We would talk or play rock, paper, scissors, or I would imagine him juggling or breakdancing or doing whatever else came to mind. I asked the researchers if my childish behavior bothered them, but they approved of what I was doing. We continued to play and talk, and it was fun for a while. Then something strange started happening. Once, I was telling him about my first date, and he corrected me. I said my girlfriend was wearing a yellow top, and he said it was green. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. It freaked me out, and after my shift, I talked to the researchers about it. You use thought forms to access your subconscious, they explained. On some level of your subconscious, you knew you were wrong, and your subconscious corrected you. What had seemed creepy suddenly seemed cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I discovered that I could ask my tulpa questions and access any depths of my memory. I could quote entire pages from books I had read years ago, remember things I had been taught and immediately forgotten in school. It was amazing. Around this time, I started summoning my doppelganger outside the research center. At first, it wasn't often, but I got so used to imagining him that I felt uncomfortable when he wasn't around. So, as soon as I got bored, I would imagine my doppelganger. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was fun to have him around like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends, took him to meet my mom, and once even took him on a date. I know it sounds strange, but it was fun. He wasn't just a repository for all the information I once knew and forgot. He sometimes seemed more interested in me than I was in him. He also had a supernatural ability to read body language that I didn't even know I had. For example, I thought the date I took him on went badly, but he pointed out that the girl laughed too much at my jokes, leaned toward me when I spoke, and a bunch of other little things I hadn't noticed. I listened and became convinced that the date had gone very well. By that time, I had spent 4 months at the research center, and he was with me constantly. One day, after my shift, the researchers came up to me and asked if I had stopped imagining him. I said no, and they seemed satisfied. I quietly asked my double if he knew what that meant, but he just shrugged. I didn't understand either. I fell out of the world a little at that moment. It became difficult for me to interact with people. They seemed so stupid and insecure to me, while I could always consult with myself. This made me feel uncomfortable. No one seemed to have any idea why they did what they did, what motivated their actions, why some things drove them crazy and others made them laugh. They didn't know what drove them, but I knew, at least I could ask myself and get an answer. One evening, a friend burst in on me. He broke down the door before I could fully open it. He was furious. You didn't answer my calls for weeks. You piece of shit, he yelled. What the hell is your problem? I was about to apologize to him, and maybe we would have continued the evening drinking together at a bar, but my tulpa suddenly flew into an indescribable rage. Hit him, it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I punched my friend. I heard his nose break. He fell, then jumped up and lunged at me with his fists, and we started fighting, beating each other and turning the apartment upside down. I had never been so enraged before, and I was merciless. I knocked him down and kicked him twice in the ribs. He ran away, bent over and sobbing. The police arrived a few minutes later, but I told them that he had started the fight, and since he wasn't there to refute my words, I was simply given a warning. My tulpa smiled the whole time. We spent the night discussing my victory and laughing about how well I had beaten up my friend. The next morning, when I saw my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, I realized what had caused the fight. It was my doppelganger who had gotten angry, not me. I felt guilty, even a little ashamed, but he had made me start a fight with an old friend. He was nearby and, of course, heard my thoughts. You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone anymore, he said to me, and I felt goosebumps run down my skin. I told the researchers who were working with me about this, but they just laughed at me. You can't be afraid of what you imagine, one of them said. My doppelganger stood next to him, nodded his head, and then smiled at me. I tried to follow their advice, but over the next few days I became increasingly anxious about my tulpa. He seemed to be changing. He seemed taller and more menacing. There was a mischievous gleam in his eyes, and his constant smile concealed a sinister intent. I decided that no job was worth going crazy over. If I couldn't control it, I had to get rid of it. By that point, I had become so accustomed to it that the visualization process happened automatically, and I tried with all my might not to think about it. Took a few days, but it started to work. I could get rid of him for a few hours a day, but every time he came back, he got worse. His skin seemed to turn deathly pale, and his teeth became sharper. He hissed, threatened, and cursed. The disturbing music I had been listening to for months now accompanied him everywhere. Even at home, when I relaxed and let myself forget, not concentrating on not seeing him, he would appear, and that awful music with him. I continued to visit the research center and spend 6 hours there. I needed money, and I assumed that I was unaware that I was no longer representing my tulpa. I was wrong. One day, after a shift, when 5.5 months had passed, 2 huge orderlies grabbed me and someone in a white coat gave me an injection. I woke up again in a room, tied to a bed, loud music blaring, and my doppelganger standing over me, grinning. He no longer looked human. His limbs were strangely twisted. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, like a corpse. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted, and his nails looked more like claws. In short, he was terrifying. I tried to get rid of him, but I couldn't concentrate. He laughed and patted me on the shoulder. I struggled on the bed with all my might, trying to break free, but I could hardly even move. They've filled you with good shit. How's your head? Everything blurry. He leaned closer and closer as he said this. I held my breath. His mouth stank of rotten meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't get him away. The next few weeks were terrible. One of the doctors would come in and inject me with something or force-feed me pills. They kept me in such a state that I couldn't concentrate, and sometimes I started hallucinating. My thought form was still there, grinning constantly. It interacted with my delirium. It seemed to me that my mother was in the room, scolding me, and then it came up behind her and slit her throat, and her blood dripped on me. It was so real that I thought I could taste the blood. The doctors never spoke to me. Sometimes I begged them, screamed, spat out pills, demanded answers. They didn't talk to me. They talked to my tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure if it was caused by the drugs, or if I was mistaken, but I remember them talking to him. I became increasingly convinced that he was real and that I was his thought form. He reinforced this idea by mocking everyone else. Another thing that seemed like a delusion was that he could touch me. Even more than that, he could hurt me. He would push and kick me when he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once he grabbed my balls, twisted them, and held them until I said I loved him. Another time, he scratched my forearm with his claw. I still have a scar there. I constantly convince myself that I hurt myself and that no hallucination is responsible for it. Constantly. And then one day, when he was telling me how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he stopped. A puzzled look came over his face, and he reached out and touched my forehead, just like my mother used to do when I had a fever. He sat there like that for a long time, and then he smiled. "All thoughts are material," he said to me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was free. Trembling, I walked to the door. It was unlocked. I stepped out into the deserted hallway and ran. I fell several times, but I made my way down the stairs and out to the parking lot behind the building. There I collapsed, crying like a child. I knew I had to go, but I couldn't. Finally, I made my way home. I don't remember how. I locked the door and blocked it with a dresser and slept for a day and a half. No one came for me that night or the next day or later. It was over. I spent a week locked in my room, but it felt like an eternity. I had broken off all contact with everyone long before these events, so no one noticed I was gone. The police found nothing. The research center was empty when they searched it. No documents were found. The names I gave them turned out to be fake. I suspect that even the source of the money I received was impossible to trace. I've recovered, if you can call it that. I don't leave the house much, and sometimes I have panic attacks. I scream. I can't sleep for a long time, and I have terrible nightmares. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the techniques those bastards taught me to convince myself of that. Sometimes it works, but not today. 3 days ago, my mother called me. A tragedy had occurred. My sister had been the victim of a serial killer, the police said. The killer guts his victims. The funeral was this afternoon. It went as well as a funeral can, I think. Anyway, I digress. From somewhere far away, I heard music. Disgusting, disturbing music, and screeches, and the sounds of a modem connecting. I can still hear those sounds, louder this time.